There is, of course, the obvious concern with social distancing, and even though governments are slowly but surely reopening our economies, there's still health concerns out there, and there's people that just want to try to keep a distance from folks to begin with. But then there's just, again, all of the reasons that home-based businesses were attractive to people in times of peace and plenty make them even more attractive now. People are out of work, as you mentioned. It's hard, even in normal times, to start a business. You have a lot less risk and a lot less expense when you get to do that from home. If you're working from home, you have flexibility. Sadly, a lot of parents are struggling to figure out what to do with kids these days. Schools have been closed. Childcare options are not nearly as plentiful as they used to be. And so, again, just being able to work from home and to have that flexibility and to have that little bit of lower risk is just more meaningful now than it perhaps ever has been.
And, it's interesting because it really just seems like common sense. It seems like the sort of thing that everyone should agree with. Of course, in reality, that's not really the case, particularly at certain bureaucratic levels out there. And so, Christina, I mentioned at the beginning that you've developed legislation to deal with this issue. Can you tell us a little bit about what the legislation does and why it's even necessary?
Yeah, well, the legislation is, it's really simple, right? It just says that if you want to run a business from home and you have no impact on your community, so in other words, you're not bothering anybody, you're not increasing traffic, you don't have lots of cars parked outside your home, there isn't noise, you're not putting trash out into the street. Essentially, no one would be the wiser that you're even operating a business out of your home, then you get to do that. You have the freedom to do that without having to ask government for permission first, without having to go through burdensome, lengthy permitting processes and licensing processes, without having to pay exorbitant fees to the government in order to get their blessing to be able to run your business, and without having to be regulated in a whole host of different ways. Now, it seems like that would be common sense, as you alluded to. It seems like if I'm working from home and I'm not bothering anybody, I should just be presumed to be able to do that. And yet, unfortunately, cities across the country, and I wish I could say it was just limited to a few, but cities and counties nationwide have placed extreme regulations on people's ability to operate a business out of their home. In some cities, it is illegal. In some cities, it is actually a crime, punishable by fines or jail time. And in some cities, you can do it so long as you jump through all of the government's arbitrary, confusing, unclear, unfair hoops, and again, pay sort of, exorbitant fees to the government for the privilege of being able to earn income out of your own home. So I'm sad to report that this legislation is actually very much needed. And one might think that in times of crisis like this, you might see cities easing up on these restrictions. Of course, we've seen that with other government agencies easing up on some economic restrictions, but we haven't really seen that here. In fact, we still see people that are, getting in trouble from working from home. And so now more than ever is a time for this type of legislation to crack down on what I think is just an egregious overreach on the part of local governments.
It is one of the many things that's offensive about it is when you think about your own home and your own property, we all have to pay property taxes. In a lot of communities, you have to pay development fees. And of course, the whole idea is that development should sort of pay for itself. Mm-hmm. But of course, it doesn't really pay for itself. It pays for or I should say this, it doesn't pay for itself just one time. It pays for itself hundreds of times over. And so the cities are more than happy to collect property taxes year in and year out, and even increase property taxes as time goes on, even though you've already more than paid for any use of city services. So I think I think it's particularly offensive. And I'll tell our audience out there, I spent quite a few years out at the legislature before I came to the Goldwater Institute. So I worked with an organization called the League of Cities and Towns for a number of years. And for those of you who don't know, the League of Cities and Towns is an organization that just represents the cities across the country. Now they're not a government organization, they're a private association, although interestingly, they do draw down retirement from the state, which is which is fairly offensive, but that is a subject for another day. But I actually spoke with the League of Cities and Towns about this issue just a couple of years ago. And of course, you won't be surprised to hear this, but they are opposed to almost anything that involves the free market. But one of the things that really stuck out the most to me when I had this discussion with the league, and I talked to their lobbyists and also the mayor at the time, who was the president of the League of Cities and Towns, was that they really believe that they have a right to know what you all are doing in your homes. And they also have a very low opinion of their own constituents. And what I mean by that is, in their minds, there's always some sort of nefarious activity that's going on inside people's homes if they don't know about it, when, of course, as all of you know, and I think common sense would tell us, most people are just trying to earn a living and provide for their family. And so, Christina, you've done a lot of work over the years defending people against all sorts of bureaucratic injustices, particularly at the municipal level. And so I'm curious to hear from you, why is it that that municipal mentality, that city and town mentality, the area that, if anything, they always like to say we're closest to the people. Why is it that this municipal mentality always seems to be anti-free market and always seems to be that we do not trust our own constituents?
Yeah, no, it is so true. And you do hear that a lot. And I think a lot of people on the right, a lot of conservatives and libertarians tend to think of their cities as being closer to them and therefore maybe more responsive to them. But of course, and this is something that goes back to our country's founders, Madison warned about this in the Federalist Papers. Of course, a government that is close enough to be responsive to the people is also a government that's close enough to be responsive to very small special interests or very moneyed special interests, NIMBY neighbors. And of course, at the end of the day, these are people that exercise an immense amount of power. We think about the federal government when we think about government and having so much power and such an impact on our lives. But really, it's our local municipalities, it's our cities and our counties that have a tremendous influence over everything, as you mentioned. I mean, taxes and whether we can run a business and how we live in our homes and how we interact with our neighbors. And so you can imagine that, first of all, you've got elected officials that just harness this immense amount of power and can get very, very close. They basically, there's always an open door to special interests that want to hijack them for their own personal purposes, which are, of course, usually anti-free market purposes because there's special favors for special select groups. But also, even worse than that, you lack checks and balances at the local level that you actually, to a degree, at least in theory, have at the state or federal level. So, most cities they have some sort of city manager or somebody like that who is not an elected official, somebody who's hired and appointed and often paid a handsome salary to run the city. Then there's all sorts of city staff. Oftentimes, it's certainly true of Arizona, they are more handsomely rewarded than the meager staff at the state legislature. And so those people have a tremendous amount of power, and they're not even elected. They're not even accountable to constituents. So, you and I, who have to live under these city ordinances and these city regulations, can't even vote those people out of office. And I mean, we've heard horror stories, Victor, about how members of city council who are trying to do right by their constituents are blindsided when staff will put things on an agenda or will take action that the elected officials, don't even know about. So, and then to top it off, if you've been wronged by your local government, or if your rights have been violated, you go to court. A lot of those prosecutions go through city court. And our investigative journalist, Mark Flatten, did a fantastic series that I highly recommend folks check out. It's on our website. Talk about how, in Arizona, the city courts, they operate at the behest of local government. So those judges are appointed and fired by city councils. And of course, city councils rely on courts to uphold prosecutions of individuals who are violating laws like, God forbid, working from home, because that's a huge revenue source to the city. The city gets a lot of money from those fines and fees. So it just really is sort of this perfect storm of control without any kind of checks or balances. And so I always say, to folks who talk about local control, well, at the end of the day, that's still control, right? And that's not freedom, that's still control. And local governments can be helpful in pushing back sometimes, and sometimes there are things that have to be decided at the local level, but we should always be very weary of giving power to local officials that are elected and unelected.
When it does seem like a lot of times the motivation at the city level is oftentimes really unrelated to actual public policy concerns, and instead it has to do with, is there a way that we can monetize this and get even more money out of our taxpayers? There was a great example just over the last handful of months where, of course, the city of Phoenix went out, the Phoenix City Council went out and passed a 300% tax increase on taking an Uber to and from the airport. Now you can imagine that even out at the legislature, even for folks that maybe want to do that, they would be very hard pressed to propose a 300% tax increase on anything. But as you indicated, they kind of do it under the radar, and to a great extent, it goes back to they also don't care a lot about what the constituents say. I mean, the voters of Arizona just a little over a year ago passed a measure that they believe were prohibiting those sort of taxes, and now Phoenix got away with it anyway. And so I do think when it comes to home-based businesses, a lot of it has to do with, can they turn it into a revenue generator? I mean, I think their opposition really diminishes if we would just agree to allow them to collect a substantial fine for people having the privilege of getting to work out of their own home. So here's people actually helping the economy, doing the right thing, especially in these times of a pandemic. And yet I believe that most cities and towns are still just looking at dollar signs.
Oh yeah, well, like you say, no good deed goes unpunished, because they're not only boosting the economy and contributing to the economy, but also, they're decreasing, again, they're being socially responsible, if you will. They're not going out there and being in contact with, more people, if that's helpful. They're, even for environmentalists, it's fewer commutes, it's fewer people on the road, it's less traffic, it's more time at home with family. And so they're doing all of the things that you really want to be done in a local community and contributing to the community. And then, yeah, exactly. What do they get? They get punished, they get fined, they get treated literally like criminals by their cities.
And over the last few years, we have had a number of home-based businesses reach out to us, and we've uncovered various cases of abuse. You mentioned a few minutes ago about some of the issues that people have to deal with when dealing with the cities, but can you give us some examples of how home-based businesses are actually being threatened today?
Yeah, I think for most of these home-based businesses, they are really unwittingly breaking the law, right? Because most people probably just assume that it's perfectly fine for me to work from home as long as I don't bother anyone. As you said, most people are actually good neighbors and good people and just want to, earn a living for their family. And so for a regulator, though, there is no innovation that it can exist outside of regulation. So I think for local bureaucrats, if somebody's working from home, they think, well, gosh, if we don't have an ordinance or a law or a rule or a process that applies to that, boy, we ought to make one. There's a great, and by great I mean horrible, example actually just out of our own backyard. The city where I live, city of Chandler, Arizona, there was a woman named Kim O'Neill, and she operated a medical billing business. So she did medical bills. It's really doesn't take a whole lot of equipment or anything like that, not a lot of overhead. She wanted to start working from home because her father was unfortunately ill. He needed hospice care to come in. She also had a couple of children, and it was just the flexibility she needed in her personal life, but it also gave her the ability to be able to earn that income that was much needed. And she employed a couple of people, and these were actually other women who needed that kind of flexibility. So it was just a wonderful business. The city of Chandler found out that she was running this business out of her home. Now, she didn't have customers coming in and out. She did have a couple of women working at her kitchen table with her, but of course, oftentimes people have visitors during the day that will come over and watch television or have lunch. So it was no different from that. Well, the city didn't have a regulation that pertained to her, so they thought, gosh, we got to come up with one. And they didn't know what that would be because, again, she wasn't causing any problems. So why would you need a regulation? So what they did is first they told her, well, you can operate, but you need to have a commercial parking lot installed. Now, one can imagine if she has no impact on her residential neighborhood, making her put in a parking lot is probably going to do the exact opposite, right? It's going to have more of an impact on her residential neighborhood. And so, of course, she said that was absurd, not to mention she had maybe 1 or 2 cars and they were in her driveway. So then they said, okay, well, you can't have employees work out of your house. And again, this is, if she wanted to have these women over to watch television or do book club, that would be totally fine. So she said, okay, fine. They will go work at their own houses. I'll work at mine. I am literally now just sitting at my kitchen table doing medical billing. And the city said, well, no, that's still a business out of your home. I mean, this went on and on and on for months. Meanwhile, this is actually really sad. I mean, she's dealing with her sick father, trying to take care of her family. She eventually just gave up. And, the city could not come up with some kind of regulation that it thought met what it needed, even though it had no idea what that was. Meanwhile, her neighbors all around said they were perfectly fine with her doing their business. Unsurprisingly, most of them didn't even know that she was operating one. They couldn't care less. And nevertheless, her business, was thwarted by bureaucry. And there are countless stories like this.
Well, it almost sounds like in that particular example, it really sounds like it's a way for the cities to say, well, we're not saying you can't do it, but we're just going to put so many roadblocks in front of you that you can't do it.
Yeah.
But we're not telling you can't. If you can just meet our bar that keeps getting higher, then you can do it, and we're going to basically put you out of business without trying to look like a bad guy.
No, that is true because that's what cities often say when we present these copious examples to cities, to state legislators, whatever. That's exactly what the city says. They say, well, look, I mean, she's the one, we didn't deny her a home-based business license. I mean, she's the one that gave up. She's the one who rescinded her application or told us she didn't want to work from home anymore, which is just so absurd because, I mean, what else was she supposed to do? She literally did everything that they asked of her, worked with them, and they still wouldn't give her, wouldn't let her work from home. But that is absolutely true. And sometimes, these cities, they have rules already on the books that are supposed to deal with, an actual zoning issue or potential nuisance, and then they try to sort of pigeonhole these home-based businesses into them. So recently, and this one is also really upsetting to me because this is happening right as this, pandemic is becoming an issue and people really need to be able to earn a living more than ever before. A woman in Virginia, she worked from home. She was a teacher. She has a young son. She wanted to be able to work from home and raise him. So she found this online website. It's like an eBay or something like that, but it's specifically for women who want to sell clothing online. And it's a great community, and she was making money. And so she sits in her home and sells clothes online, and she didn't have customers come into her house or anything like that. The city the county actually, they shut her down because they said that she was violating zoning rules. And she said, well, what zoning rules am I violating? And they said, well, you're operating a retail establishment and you have inventory, and that's not allowed in a residential zone. Well, I mean, one can imagine when those rules were written, what they were talking about. A retail establishment, they mean that, they don't want a Costco or a Target or a Walmart in the middle of a neighborhood. And whatever you may think of that, that's something very different from, I'm sitting in my home selling things on eBay. I think most of us have done that before. So she fought it. She took it to court because she just, she so badly wanted that right, and she wasn't bothering anyone. By the way, when the county came in and told her she couldn't do that, they made her get rid of all of her clothes in 5 days, the clothes that she had, and I mean, it's just absurd. How did that bother anybody that she had clothes? If those clothes were in her house for her own personal use, that would have been fine. But since they were in there to sell, she had to liquidate. She lost $30,000. And the court essentially said, well, no, because this is another thing. This is what happens. You can't even win your day in court because you go to court, and courts always, they apply a test that is just very favorable to government. And they say, no, if the government thinks that their ordinance applies to you, then we're just going to go ahead and rubber stamp what the government did. And that's what happened to her. She was put out of business, even though she was doing nothing wrong. And she had people sign petitions online begging to allow her to still sell. So that's why we have to do something like the Home-Based Business Act, because I mean, you can't win at the city level. You can't get courts. Very, very rarely do people win cases like this. You just don't see it happening because the courts rubber stamp what the government does.
So you really do have to change the law.
You have to change the law. You have to change the rules. And again, the Home-Based Business Fairness Act is just, it's very simple for people like Kim O'Neill, for people like the woman in Virginia selling clothes, people that want to do people's taxes at home, or, tutor, give violin lessons, or arrange flowers, or sell things online. People who aren't bothering anybody else, they just get the presumption, they just get the freedom to be able to work. And if government wants to regulate people who are working from home, the government has to have a really good health and safety reason for doing that, or show that there's an impact on the community. And they have to prove that if someone were to go to court. And, it's a very reasonable law, but it's really going to be a game changer because it's the only way most of these people can win their freedom to work from home.
Well, one of the things that you said really jogged a thought with me, and it's that it does seem like that whenever there's a new technological innovation, rather than embrace it, which is what you would think government at all levels should do, if it's making life easier for citizens, if it's making it easier for people to earn a living, to provide for their families, you would think if anything the government would embrace it. But that doesn't seem to be the case. It seems like whenever there's a new innovation, whether it comes from ride sharing, home-based businesses, whatever the case may be, it seems like that the government's instant reaction is to go in and regulate it, and maybe even try to stamp it out.
Mm-hmm.
Is it safe to say that when we're talking about the area of home-based businesses, as they become more prolific, rather than the government embrace it, they have become a lot more punitive?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, you never get cities asking, should we regulate? They say, how can we regulate? How can we tax this? How can we regulate it? And it's ironic because actually home-based businesses are part of the fabric of this country and this country's history. If you look back at, the early times of our country, most people worked in very close proximity to their homes. And that's why when you think about traditional main streets, you see homes, or apartments or lofts right above the businesses. That's because their home and work was indistinguishable. They didn't have the means to be able to commute, and that's how we did things. And so every business was essentially a home-based business. Then, of course, with the Industrial Revolution, we see people, able to commute. People move out to suburbs, and there's a little bit of a different situation. That is also around the time when we started seeing zoning, where again, for better or worse, whatever you think of zoning, it's certainly been used by government and by special interests to put laws into place to keep certain undesirables out. And what is undesirable? Well, it's whatever the government and the special interests say it is, which of course can be quite dangerous. And that's right around the time they started putting these restrictions into place. Now we've done sort of a full circle because technological advances, especially in telecommunications, have now allowed us to return to working from home and to having more home-based businesses, but they look very different because, again, these are not you living above a storefront. These are businesses that, again, don't have any impact on the community. And as you say, we should be embracing that. I mean, it's actually amazing. Since the pandemic, there is a company called NameSnack. It's an online company, and they help you find a name for your business and register it and all of that. They said they've seen an uptick of 362% every single day of people using their services, and most of those are home-based businesses that are just starting, again, probably because of the pandemic. And so, there's a service that helps people do that. There's services that will actually come to your house and say, okay, if you operate a home-based business and telecommunications is really important to you, we'll make sure that, many of us have probably experienced problems with Wi-Fi going in and out as we're all working from home. They'll make sure you're all hooked up, that you've got backup, you have a generator if you lose your power, whatever it is that you need to help you run your business from home. It's a one-stop shop. I mean, these are market innovations that are making it easier for people to work from home. And of course, businesses that start in people's homes, many of them go on to be, really big businesses that employ lots of people. Like we all know that Disney and Hewlett Packard and the computer companies and Harley Davidson, they all started out of somebody's house or garage. So these are all very good things, as you say, and they don't cost the taxpayers a cent. And what does government do? Well, it bites the hand that feeds it, and it says, no, we got to find some way to make this harder. We have to put regulations in place, or tax it out of existence, or put fees, to make it not exist. And most people just can't navigate that type of system to the extent they're even allowed to do it. And the sad thing is, the one thing government's supposed to do is, protect people, protect our rights, stop people from harming each other. And most of these regulations have nothing to do with that.
No question. One other question I had for you. You had talked a little bit about some of the types of businesses that operate as home-based businesses.
Yeah.
It's always interesting because when you talk to the opponents of home-based business, they always come up with extreme examples, really crazy examples, like that folks are going to open up a nuclear power plant or a munitions facility in their living room.
Right.
And of course, that's crazy. Is there a typical type of business that from what you've seen is the typical type of home-based business, or does it run a pretty broad gamut?
Yeah, it's actually pretty broad. Well, the one thing I'll say that's typical is a typical home-based business has no impact on the community, isn't noticed. Not a nuclear power plant, no. I kind of trying to figure out in my head what that would actually look like, but no, that is not the typical home-based business. No, the typical business, and there actually isn't a typical one, which is actually kind of neat. Again, like I said, there are a lot of professionals like attorneys, accountants, people who do taxes, people who are web designers, people who are podcasters, people who are doing things like we're doing today, and doing teleforums and things like that. They do a lot of home-based businesses. There are also people that will serve small groups, again, not large, but small groups of clients, people who, who will tutor children or teach music lessons, or maybe teach yoga to a small group of people in their living room, things like that. Then there are also businesses, and many of us are familiar with these, where larger companies allow people to start their own businesses and give them everything that they need. So I'm talking about things like Avon, or, Victor, I don't know if you've ever been to a Tupperware party, but I've hosted a couple of those in my day, but Avon or Tupperware, Beachbody, the fitness equipment and fitness drinks and things like that. These are companies that already have a working model, and much like a McDonald's or something like that can be franchised by individuals. It's a similar type of model, but it's on a much smaller scale. They give you the stock and everything you need, and a lot of times you don't even really need to keep a whole lot in your own home. And then you just go ahead and nowadays people aren't even having parties in person as much. They're doing them virtually. So, they'll set up a Facebook group and they'll say, hey, I'm selling lipstick, do you want to buy it? And all of your friends across the world can come on, and, a lot of times that lipstick never even comes to your home. It just comes from a warehouse and it goes to these people, but I'm operating a business out of my home and earning money and having flexibility. So there really isn't a typical home-based business, but that's the beauty of the market, is that sort of the sky's the limit with what people can do and how entrepreneurial people can be from their homes.
And then one other question. Not only are we looking at doing this type of legislation right here in Arizona, we're also looking at moving it across the country. We think it could be a really tremendous tool, along with eliminating licenses and other things like that, to really help people get back to work as quickly as possible as we start to transition, hopefully, out of this coronavirus pandemic. What's been the response around the country? Have other states expressed interest in this type of legislation? Yeah,
it's been overwhelmingly positive. The interesting thing is, we've been talking about this issue at Goldwater for a few years, but I don't think legislators have really had it on the forefront of their minds until now, because the economy up until a few months ago, sadly, was just so good and so strong. And I think they just, didn't really see the problem or the need. Now, suddenly, everyone's working from home. The economy's not so good. People need flexibility and opportunity. And every legislator, whether they're out of session now and thinking about the agendas when they go back to their state houses, or the few that are still in session, are thinking like, what can we do? And so we have gotten just an enormous response. In fact, we've actually had legislators reach out to us without us having to reach out to them first and say, hey, we've heard about your home-based business bill, or we remember it. And we want this to be at the top of our legislative agenda. because it just makes sense. And because it's an important recovery measure. So I'm actually really excited about the possibilities. I wish it were under different circumstances, that we were getting such a response. But I really am excited about how many states are looking at running the bill. And frankly, although we've talked about a lot of bad cities out there and a lot of bad counties, there are some good ones too. And I have actually had, I'm sure none of them want to go on the record, but I've actually had members of city councils or city attorneys or city managers reach out to me and say, hey, look, like, we actually think this is a pretty reasonable way of doing things. Sometimes they get contacted by people that, and they just in that bureaucratic mindset, they just don't know how to regulate. And they say, hey, look, if the state just tells us, hey, leave people alone once they're causing a problem, it seems reasonable to us, and, we can do that. So I'm really excited about the prospects of being able to get this legislation passed across the country.
Well, I'm glad that you mentioned that there are cities out there that do in fact support this type of legislation, even if some of them feel like that they can't support it publicly. Because you look in any state in the country, and Arizona is certainly no different. We do have a number of bedroom communities in the state, and right here in the Valley, where there's not a tremendous amount of commercial revenue coming in. And so in some ways, I do think at the city level, it's sort of a fight between the big cities who have plenty of commercial development. They have a good mix of commercial and residential. And for them, they really don't care if there's home-based businesses. In fact, they're opposed to it. I do think some of the smaller cities are more supportive. But of course, the way the political dynamics work is they don't really want to get on the bad side of the larger cities.
Right.
But I think the broader point is these larger cities, even if they feel like home-based businesses are just don't serve as strong of a purpose in their community, they're really doing the rest of the state a tremendous disservice by opposing this type of legislation.
Yeah, no, exactly. That's exactly right.
I know we have a bunch of folks on this teleform, so I'd like to open it up for questions from the audience. Do we have any questions lined up?
I have a question. You've talked about the difficulty of fighting City Hall when local government wants to usurp your right to run a home business. What recourse do people who live in an HOA governed community have when an HOA enacts regulations or rules prohibiting any kind of home-based business?
Yeah, that's a good question. There is a difference, of course, between government putting a law into place saying you can't work out of your home in an HOA. An HOA is, technically a private arrangement, right? Where when you move into the community, you're essentially signing a contract with everybody else in that community, agreeing to abide by certain rules. And of course, we can see why some people might want to do that. I live in an HOA, although I didn't necessarily want to, but those are the options on my side of town. And and of course we all agree, hey, I'll make sure not to let my weeds grow too tall, or I'll agree to paint my house as just certain colors, just so long as everybody agrees to that. We encourage private discussions or private agreements, because at least then people are all kind of agreeing to the same thing and assenting, and it's different than government imposing it on you. So, but you're right, unfortunately, HOAs have become their own kind of little quasi-governments. They're not technically government, so you don't have the same kind of recourse against them that you do against the actual government, which has the Constitution that it needs to follow. HOAs, once you sign into them, they have their own rules that limit what they can do, but essentially you are in a situation where they can impose some pretty tough restrictions on you. And so, it's one of those things where, I always encourage people to read their CC&Rs and their HOA regulations before they move in. Make sure it's something that you're comfortable with and agree to. But I feel for you. I totally understand how HOAs can be very overbearing sometimes.
Well, and Christina, when it comes to HOAs, you mentioned the CC&Rs, And there are certainly times when HOAs try to overstep the bounds of the CCNR. So is it accurate that when they go outside the bounds of those CCNRs, because a lot of HOAs now in Arizona have been around for 20 or 30 years. It really became a pretty prevalent idea, especially for growing cities back around 1990. So a lot of these CCNRs are pretty old, and a lot of them haven't been updated. And I suspect there are a lot of HOAs that are doing things that technically they're not even supposed to do within the CCNR. So would a person have legal recourse at that point?
It's a great point. They absolutely would. Yeah, I mean, look, your HOA rules and regulations and CCNRs are essentially a contract, which is great. That's what we want in a free society. We want people to be able to contract. But if your HOA does something beyond what it's allowed to do, it's breaking that contract, and then you do have the recourse to be able to go to court. So yeah, there are definitely options. And at least when you go to court and you're going up against your HOA for doing something wrong, at least there you have a fair chance, of winning. I mean, of course, you have to pay for an attorney and all that, but it's not a situation where when you sue the government, the deck is stacked against you, because the law regarding property or economic regulations actually is, well, no, we're just going to presume the government is right.
My understanding, Declaration of Independence comes in with the idea of unalienable from God, unalienable right of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. The pursuit of happiness, in my mind, it's my understanding that includes the property ownership rights and the ability to make an honest living. Is there some way that concept can come in and trump off all these municipality attempts at taking away a God-given right?
Yeah, it's a great question. Unfortunately, I am a lawyer. Don't hold it against me. I promise I'm a nice one. But you're absolutely right. Sometimes I wish I could just give a copy of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution to all of these city council people and just say, look, read this. And you probably half of what you're doing, you would realize is not really what you're supposed to be doing. Since we can't do that, or since if we do that, they just basically ignore it, we have to, as we were talking about earlier, we just have to change the rules. We cannot expect these local officials to follow the Declaration of Independence, which you are absolutely correct, protects people's right to earn an honest living, protects people's right to use their property as they see fit, so long as they're not harming anyone. We just cannot expect them to follow that. And people say, well, vote the bums out. And as we've discussed, though, well, first of all, you just get more and do the same thing. But also you've got these unelected bureaucrats at the city level. So the way that we incorporate those critical principles from the Declaration of Independence is by passing these laws that essentially force cities to stay within their scope. It says, look, cities, nobody wants a nuclear power plant, I guess, right next to their home, unless it's zoned that way. So, I mean, you can keep up businesses that don't make sense. You can make sure that people aren't being noisy or that there, isn't traffic or things like that. You can put occupancy limits in place. But after that, your job is done. And at that point, freedom takes over and people have the right to do what they want in their homes. And so that is how we incorporate, I think, those principles. We just, not quite as eloquently spoken perhaps as our founders have done so, but we put them in laws that have teeth that you can enforce in court, and that's good enough for me.
But I do think that for a lot of folks, and it's unfortunate, but when you're trying to start a home-based business or do those sort of similar activities, and the government comes and tells you no, or they say we're going to impose a huge fee or fine, I think it acts as a tremendous discouragement from folks to move forward. So even in opportunities where maybe challenges to things the cities are doing, folks like us may not even find out about it because people just throw their hands up and give up. And I think that's another reason why it's very important that we go in and actually change the law so that the law actually explicitly benefits the person trying to open up their business or engage in other free market activities, and take some of that firepower away from the government.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, when I said the Declaration of Independence, I didn't mean to limit it to that. I thought it was embedded in the Constitution. And these people take an oath of office. It's my understanding in 1952, President Truman got sued because he went out of his oath of office against some steel mill or some sort, something like that. And aren't they in violation of their oath of office to uphold the Constitution and which includes statutes when they go outside their box that they're supposed to be operating in?
Yeah, that's a great point. I will say you're right that it's not just the courts that are obligated to enforce the Constitution. One thing that people often forget is that anyone who's elected to government takes an oath of office to uphold the Constitution. And yet these local officials, even though that is their job too, they just say, well, we'll throw caution to the wind. We'll go ahead and pass these regulations. We'll stop people from earning an honest living. And then the courts can just sort it out. And then as Victor said, usually you're out of luck because unless you have the free and excellent services of Goldwater Institute lawyers, you can't afford a lawyer. You don't know how to get a lawyer. You're financially and emotionally exhausted from fighting City Hall. I mean, we've mentioned some of the processes, but I mean, we're even talking about rules like how much square footage you can operate a business from home, so long as you keep that business under a certain square footage of your house. So there was a guy who was testing medical devices in his house, not on people, just testing them to make sure they were like blood pressure cuffs and things like that. And the city said, well, you're doing this in both your living room and your kitchen, which means you're using about 40% of the house, and you're only allowed to use 25% of your house as a home-based business. And then he's got to go ahead and try to prove to the city and that he's not in this room or he is in this room or whatever. I mean, it's crazy and it's exhausting. And these people forget, as you say, that their job isn't to determine what room somebody does their work in their home. Their job is to uphold the Constitution, uphold our rights, and keep us safe regardless of what level of government they're at. So again, that's why I think the Home-Based Business Fairness Act is important, because it just ensures that if elected officials are going to forget that they took an oath of office, then we will remind them with legislation that is enforceable in court if need be.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's my understanding when they take an oath of office and they violate it, they can be personally sued. For example, if the Governor Ducey goes outside of his box, it's my understanding he can be personally sued and you can take his personal property from him for his arrogant ego.
Yeah, one of the unfortunate things about trying to hold elected officials accountable is that a lot of times you can't go after them personally in court, right? They have what is called immunity. So that means that you get a city council person. This is actually really interesting because sometimes city council people, and again, I like to assume good motives, but sometimes they really just have a vendetta against somebody and want to go after a home-based business, right? Just because they don't like that particular person. And this happens a lot more, unfortunately, on the local level. So there was this one guy in Tennessee that had a home-based business, and it was a guitar pedal shop. Like he made custom guitar pedals. And he went out there to advertise his business, and the local newspaper actually did a feature on him, wrote about how great it was. Well, this city council person saw that in the newspaper and was like, I don't think he asked my permission first. He didn't come to the city and ask first. He just went to the newspaper and just assumed he'd be able to do his business. So they went after him and shut him down because the city council was essentially just, offended that he went and advertised first. And of course, that person, that bureaucrat that went after him, you can't go to court and hold them accountable. There's no personal, as you're kind of mentioning, caller, there's no personal accountability for these officials because if they violate somebody's rights and you go to court, there's no slap on the they get a slap on the wrist, but they don't have any financial accountability or anything like that. So again, a law that says no, this is the rules now, this is the scope of power of the city, and this is enforceable in court, I think changes that dynamic a little bit.
Yes, it's me again. I'm wondering these renegade officials violating their oaths of office and the Constitution, does that automatically mean that they are also deprived of the protections from the same document of the Constitution? In other words, Matthew 7:1 says, judge not, lest you be judged, but Matthew 7:2 says, for by the same measure you measure, it'll be measured unto you. In other words, have they just removed themselves from the protection of the Constitution and statutes because they're freely violating it and mocking it?
Yeah, one would think, but never works that way, does it? The elected officials, and again, I think it's even worse on the local level for the reasons we were discussing. They oftentimes think that they're above the law, and that the law just doesn't apply to them. So, unfortunately, again, under the existing system, they really just do get away with a lot of these regulations.
Yeah, and there are recall statutes in place for most elected officials, although not all, but for most of them there are recall statutes in place. But the bar is high, so it really does have to be something that a significant percentage of voters can be convinced is worth recalling elected officials from. But there are recall statutes in place.
But that is a good point that you bring up, because
and by the way, they have actually been used before successfully in the state.
They have. I actually, encourage more people to become familiar with those procedures. But no, it's really interesting though, because even though we were talking about how a lot of what happens at the municipal level is done by city staff or city managers or people who are not elected or responsible to the people anyway, even city officials, people just don't spend a lot of time learning about their local officials or participating in their local elections. And it's amazing, because I think if you survey people, most people know who the president is. I think almost everybody does. A lot of people know who their governor is, or who their congressmen or senators are. Probably, maybe you know who your local representative is in the state house. But then as you start going down, you ask people to name who their mayor is, who their city council members are, how many people are on their city council, how the city council is elected. Do the members come from different areas of the city? Or, I think fewer and fewer people know, and that's not to make fun of people or to say that, they don't care. It's just that, we all have other things to do in our lives. Most people don't want to spend the bulk of their day learning about every single bureaucrat that is going to affect their life. Most people just want to earn an honest living, have some downtime with their family and go about their lives. And so, but because of that, because of the way the system's set up, that really does empower these local officials, that unless you're really going to pay attention when you elect them, unless you're going to hold them accountable, things like recall, you're just going to have a situation where they're able to do whatever they want unchecked.
Well, and a lot of the city elections do not occur on the November ballot, and so they do their elections at different points in time during the year. So and it's done this way on purpose to try to discourage, or I should say this, to try to encourage the smallest possible turnout. And so in a way, as Christina alluded to, they do try to game the system in a way where they can stay in office as long as possible and be as little accountable to the people as possible.
And one point that we didn't mention either, but I think kind of plays into all this, is at least at some point, say what you want about the media, we at least used to have a robust and investigative journalism wing in most major papers, where people, newspapers really did pay attention to what local officials did. And sometimes that was the only way you were going to learn, because, for the most part, especially today with press conferences and everything, people know what is happening at the president level. People know what's happening in Congress. But, really the way that we got information about what our city council is doing is by local investigative journalists. And those are just investigative journalism in traditional papers is more or less dead. And that's why we have an investigative journalist at the Goldwater Institute on staff, and why, Mark Flatton has done so much work in this area. He finds a lot of these examples of abuse and overreach that we're then able to take to court and defend, or take to the state house and give examples about, the working mother who just wants to be able to earn a living from home and be with her family. We can bring that to our representatives and use those stories that, frankly, we would just never learn about otherwise, for reasons that you were saying, Victor, because most people they don't even know that they have these rights to defend, or that they can get help somewhere. They just get exhausted and they give up.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you very much for offering this lecture session. I'm trying to set up a business, a home product sewing business in my condo unit in San Diego, California, and I understand the tremendous time and money it takes to set up a small business at home. And right now I'm going through the pains of trying to get the condo association, CC&Rs,
the city zoning and then the federal, all that information. And I think, in my opinion, it is much easier. Well, the motivation is sapping me from my excitement to start a business, but it would be easier for me, in my opinion, to pay the company, like you said earlier, to research all that and let me know with a price and a time it takes than it is for me to spend all this time and find out that I can't do it.
Yeah, I think that's a great yet unfortunate point. The market will always find a way. I do think it's good. You're talking about paying a company that would help you set up your business from home, or at least let you know if you even can. Certainly we see that in the healthcare space when companies want to develop, and test new drugs. They have companies that help them along the way. People who want to rent out their homes. I mean, there are a lot of companies that kind of walk people through the regulatory process. Gosh, even when we get our taxes done, most of us don't really, even if they're simple, we don't really do our taxes ourselves because even if it's simple, it's still so confusing, and there's so much that you could do wrong or make a mistake that we just hire somebody to do that. So it's good that the market can come up with those things, and I think it would be great to have one that dealt specifically with home-based businesses. I know there's a company called Zonability out there that does a little bit of that, that kind of looks at municipal regulations and state regulations and does overlays and lets you know what you can and can't do in the area. But it's also just kind of sad that the market has to do that, right? Think about all the economic waste from you having to pay a company to do the research to figure out how you can operate your business from home. If the government just let you do it, you could spend that money, creating jobs and creating wealth.
Well, I think it goes back to another reason why unfortunately this type of legislation really is so important to help streamline these types of processes, make it easier for people to start home-based businesses, eliminate some of the bureaucracy involved. So I do think it's another good example of why this type of legislation is so important. But as you alluded to, caller, there's almost a sort of government business out there designed to put as many obstacles in place as possible. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to try to knock those obstacles down. So with that, we're now at the end of our time for this teleforum, but I do want to thank everyone for joining us. As Anissa mentioned, if we were not able to get to your question, please email it in. And we're going to be doing more of these teleforums in the near future. The next one will probably be dealing with education issues. So we look forward to seeing everyone again soon. And please, everyone, stay safe, and we'll talk to you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.